Alright guys, this video is going to cover Objective 2 in Chapter 10, which is the organization of skeletal muscle. And we're actually going to kind of look at it in two ways. We're going to look at it, one, in terms of the whole big organ of the muscle, but then we're also going to look at it in terms of this kind of the cellular level of the muscle. So we're looking at kind of big anatomy as well as small anatomy here. And so just so you know, a lot of times we don't think about, when we think about organs, we don't necessarily think about muscles and bones, but they are organs. They are a collection of tissues, which are a collection of cells working together. And so the muscle itself is a complete organ. So like in lab, we named specific muscles of the body. Each one of those muscles is an organ, and each one of those muscles is going to consist of cells, which we call muscle fibers. It's going to be composed of connective tissue. We're going to look at 3 different layers of connective tissue that you will find within the muscle. And then we also have blood vessels that are coming through to provide nourishment and remove waste and bring oxygen. And then you also have your nerve fibers that are kind of telling those muscles what to do. And so in terms of the skeletal muscle as a whole, okay, we're going to take a look at this for just a second, but then I'm going to kind of explain it through the picture. And so you kind of have these 3 different types of connective tissue. You have the endomysium, you have the paramysium, and you have the epimysium. And all 3 of these are coverings. Okay, so we're going to look at it in terms of the smallest all the way up to the biggest. And so I'm actually going to move over to the picture for this because I think it's easier to explain when you can kind of see what it looks like. And so we're going to start with a single muscle fiber. Okay, so this right here, this whole area here, is one muscle fiber. So this represents one muscle cell. And each muscle fiber is surrounded by what's called the endomysium. So essentially think about just kind of like a wrapping around that single muscle cell. That's what the endomysium is, okay? Now there's many different muscle cells in a muscle, and they are organized into groups called a fascicle. So you can see that this is one muscle fiber, that's a muscle fiber, that's a muscle fiber, that's a muscle fiber, okay? So you can see that several muscle fibers are going to be joined up to form a larger unit called a fascicle. All right, so several muscle cells joined together are going to form a fascicle, and that fascicle is going to be surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the paramysium. And so if we look at the bigger picture, there's a fascicle surrounded by the paramysium. There's a fascicle surrounded by the paramysium. There's a fascicle, okay? So first we have the endomysium, which surrounds a single cell. Then we have the paramysium, which surrounds a fascicle, which is a group of cells. And then we have the whole big muscle. And that whole muscle is going to be surrounded by a layer called the epimysium. And so the way I remember this is EP epi. Okay, so E for endomysium, P for paramysium, and then epi is going to be on the outside. And so starting from inside out, we have one cell surrounded by the endomysium, several cells joined together to form a fascicle, which is surrounded by the paramysium, and then several fascicles joined together to form the whole muscle, which is surrounded by the epimysium. And all of those connective tissues actually come together to form those tendons that will then connect the muscle to bones. All right, so now we're going to shift into looking at the muscle in terms of cellular levels. So if we're looking at just one muscle fiber, okay, we're looking at one muscle cell. Okay, like a lot of cells in our body, they're going to have organelles. They're going to be surrounded by a membrane. But in the case of muscles, we're going to give them a special name. Okay, so these are the same parts that we've already talked about. They just have names that are specifically referring to muscle cell parts. And so each muscle fiber is kind of a long cylinder. It's not your typical shaped cell. It is especially shaped and especially made to do its job. But each muscle fiber is going to be surrounded by the sarcolemma, which is the plasma membrane. And inside you'll find the sarcoplasm, which is just the filler, that cytoplasm and organelles that's going to be between the nuclei and the cell themselves, or the cell membrane. Now we do have a special type of ER. It's actually a type of smooth ER called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is going to be really important when it comes to contractions because this particular type of smooth ER is going to store and release calcium. And that's going to be an important component in our muscle contraction. Now we also have something that we don't find in other cells. We have these organelles called myofibrils. And these myofibrils actually contain the proteins that we call myofilaments that are responsible for the actual muscle contraction. So we don't find these myofibrils in other cell types, and we're going to have a whole little section on myofibrils here in a bit. Something else you'll find in the skeletal muscle cells or the muscle fibers are lots and lots of mitochondria. So it takes a tremendous amount of ATP to make these muscles contract, and so you will find lots of those energy producing organelles in your muscle cells. And so this is just kind of pulling out that one muscle fiber. Okay, that one muscle fiber has the sarcolemma. It would also be surrounded by that endomysium. And so inside we can see the mitochondria, we can see the cytoplasm, and we can see lots of these myofibrils. And we'll take a look at what this stuff is when we talk about myofibrils. You do have some a video that you can watch and a handout that you can use to answer some questions about the muscle. I would encourage you to do that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how the muscles are going to work with the nervous system, because in order for these muscles to contract, they have to be told to do so. And so when it comes to skeletal muscle, your skeletal muscle are going to be regulated by motor neurons. Those are the ones that are going to make the skeletal muscle move. And these particular neurons are going to be part of the somatic nervous system of the motor division. So this is our voluntary system. So you have your autonomic that controls those things that you don't have to think about. And then you have your somatic, which is essentially regulating your skeletal muscles, the things that you do have control over. And so motor neurons are just those cells that are going to stimulate an effector to do something. And so just kind of going back, you have sensory motor or sensory neurons that bring information in, and then you have motor neurons that carry information to an effector cell. And so this is the kind of neuron that we're dealing with when we're talking about muscle contraction. The cell bodies are located in the central nervous system, primarily the spinal cord, but possibly up in the brain, but mostly in your spinal cord. And then their axons are extended down to those effector cells or the skeletal muscles. And so where these two meet, where the skeletal muscle and the ends of the axons of those motor neurons meet, is called the neuromuscular junction. So like we saw with the synapse before, this is just another synapse. It's just specifically called the neuromuscular junction. So it's just that space between the axon terminals of the neuron and the muscle fiber itself. And so pretty much every skeletal muscle and every fiber within that muscle is going to be innervated by a motor neuron that's going to tell it to contract. And in fact, a lot of your muscles have more than one neuron that are actually innervating them and telling them what to do. And then each motor neuron actually innervates more than one muscle fiber. So it's not like there's one neuron for one muscle cell. There's one neuron for several muscle cells, and that's what we call a motor unit. And we'll see that come into play in our part 2 of muscles. So here you have the dendrites. Remember, those are going to be your receiving ends. These are going to be in the central nervous system. And then those axons are going to carry the message to those skeletal muscle cells. As you can see here, there's interaction with multiple nerve fibers, and so that would be a whole motor unit. Okay. You can also see that where those axon terminals meet up with that muscle cell, that's your neuromuscular junction there. And then you can see that there's different motor units. So like this green motor unit is this green neuron and these muscle fibers. We have another motor unit, the yellow neuron, and the yellow muscle fibers. And so it just goes to show you that it's not like it's a 1-to-1 ratio. There can be many muscle fibers that are going to be controlled by a single motor neuron. And we're going to stop there and come back in Objective 3 in our next video.